Hello, and welcome to this virtual event hosted by Upper House in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm Dan Hummel, one of the program curators here at Upper House, which is a Christian study center on the campus of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We're here to celebrate the recent release of a new book from InterVarsity Press, To Think Christianly, L'Abri, Regent College, and the Christian Study Center Movement. It came out in April. The book's author is Charles Cotherman, who I'll be calling Charlie, who is a historian, a pastor, and a close observer of Christian study centers, past and present. To Think Christianly is the first comprehensive history of the Christian Study Center movement. The book is well-written, well-researched, and illuminates a vast web of intellectual networks and institutional struggles that are fascinating, but until now underexplored. Throughout the book, we get to follow an influential class of educated evangelicals pursuing deeper cultural engagement with contemporary thought, and we follow their successes and failures as they model new ways of Christians engaging with academia and, more broadly, American culture. The first part of our hour today will be dedicated to hearing directly from Charlie about the contents of his book. And next, we'll move into a conversation between Charlie and Dr. Jon Boyd, academic editorial director at InterVarsity Press. Charlie and Jon will discuss some of the background to the book and some of the behind-the-scenes work that Charlie did for it. And finally, in the last part of the hour, we'll field some questions from you, the audience. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen at any point to send questions our way. I want to make sure to recognize the 9 co-sponsors of this event along with Upper House, and you'll see the names here on the screen in a minute. These co-sponsors represent not only some of the key historical organizations that Charlie covers in his book, but a number of current Christian study centers around the country, and the Consortium of Christian Study Centers with its 30+ member organizations. Thank you very much to our co-sponsors. And with that, let me quickly introduce Charlie a bit more formally. Charles Cotherman is pastor and planter of Oil City Vineyard Church in Oil City, Pennsylvania. He's the administrative director of the Project on Rural Ministry at Grove City College and has taught church history at Fuller Seminary and Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. He earned his Ph.D. at the University of Virginia, and To Think Christianly is his first book coming out of his dissertation from UVA. Charlie has also co-edited a church planning book called Sent to Flourish, also published by IVP last year. So Charlie, thank you for joining us, and we're looking forward to hearing your summary of To Think Christianly.
Hey, thanks, Dan. Glad to be here. And thanks to everyone who's joining today. As you can see, I am in my attic. This is good for you for a number of reasons, because I have 4 kids ages 8 through 4 months just below this floor. And if we were down there, it would be rough. But I always think it's kind of worthwhile to do something like this in one's own homes, because many of the stories that I talk about in the book come out of people's own homes. And I always love that photo of Schaefer working day in and day out on his bed. That was his office, his bedroom. So I guess this is in tribute to that. So yeah, to sum up and to kind of highlight a few things out of the book, really, you know, this book attempts to, maybe some disclaimers first. So one of the things this book is not is an exhaustive history of any of these organizations or of the study center movement in general, because the study center movement is vast. I mean, in some ways, study centers go back to monasticism and the kind of ora et labora of the monks working and living and learning all together, you know, and this book's really about an evangelical study center movement that really is university based. So that's kind of the first disclaimer is, you know, this is trying to show the way that these study centers have kind of moved over time toward an intentional engagement with the university. There's a lot of other study centers out there, and even people that love some of these histories. You know, if you love Regent College, it's a great history. there's more to be written about Regent College, I assure you, than what is in the chapter or two chapters that really touch on Regent in this book. But I think what these chapters do is highlight an important legacy of Regent, one of many. So that's kind of my disclaimer. You know, and I always like to say too, for the people on this call who have worked in study centers for decades, I proceed with humble confidence. I know that many of you have lived this day in and day out and have all kinds of stories and all kinds of knowledge, and I'd love to have you email me, tell me some more stories. I'm always willing to learn, but I think, you know, the process of doing this research has also led me to some things that maybe it's helpful to hear from an outsider, you know, one who's really not been knee deep in the workings of a study center at a local level. Okay, enough with the precursors. Let me highlight a few of the things. And let me just define what a study center is. One of the things that came up as I was writing this book and interacting with Jon at IVP is, you know, people might not even know what you mean by a study center. And I realize that's actually true as I talked about the book with people outside kind of my little academic niche. So I define a study center in the book as this way. I say a Christian study center is a local Christian community dedicated to spiritual, intellectual, and relational flourishing via the cultivation of deep spirituality, intellectual and artistic engagement, and the cultivation of hospitable presence. And that last part's important too. Place is an essential part of this. You know, one of the things I like to highlight is you can learn all kinds of different ways. And in fact, even in this book, we see people using video to help people learn on a mass scale, you know, like the mass production of a kind of intellectual product. But it's very different to have a talking head video than an in-person center where you're coming and you're experiencing the aromas of coffee and you're bumping into people in the doorways and just the sense of belonging that accompanies the learning and the sense of like, let's stop and pray. You know, the people on the videos don't stop and pray for you, or if they do, it's for all of you, all thousands and tens of thousands of you watching, right? But in a study center, you get learning within a hospitable place and you get that personal spiritual care and nurture. And all those things have to be there. You can't have, it can't be a study center if it's not intellectually engaged and seeking after truth. That's one of the reasons why most study centers will have a library at the very center of what they're doing, because that quest for truth and quest for intellectual engagement is so important to the study center mindset. At the same time, you have to have spiritual rootedness. It's not just another academic center. It is deeply Christian to be a study center, a Christian study center. The other thing to say is study centers take a wide variety of forms. And so even in this book, you'll see a few of those forms highlighted. I think Drew Trotter's 4-part taxonomy is helpful when you think about the ways, the main tracks that study centers take. So you can have a university-based study center, and that's what this book really highlights, the kind of campus impact of the study center movement, especially over time. But you also have destination study centers, places that aren't really close to anything, that you go there simply to be at the study center. The Ligonier Valley Study Center in rural Western Pennsylvania that R.C. Sproul started in '71 is a prime example of a destination study center. You were not on your way to anywhere when you went through Stallstown. You have church-based study centers. These have existed for a long time, and even today, people ask me, do you think it'd be good to start one in the church? People are still interested in that. And then you have city-focused study centers. And those, you know, the C.S. Lewis Institute's a prime example of that, originally in D.C., and now it's spread to multiple cities, you know, and so the impact of a city-focused study center is meant to be broader than one local community. It's meant to be over a locale that's much broader, like the size of the city. Another thing I like to say about this book is just the methodology. So this book really digs into archival research, you know, and let me tell you, and some of it shows up in the photos, things like that, but sitting in Berkeley, looking at the Christian World Liberation Front's early material of these hippie Christians, this kind of evangelical left, as historians might call it today, was so fascinating. Similarly, when I was at Regent in the basement of the library, looking over boxes and boxes of the very recently at that time, James Houston Fawns, it was just such an enlightening experience, you know? And so this is actually the first book to make extensive use of James Houston's papers. And I think it was a huge contribution to the book. And I'm still grateful to Jim Houston for allowing me to do that. Okay, so let's talk about the actual content a little bit. This book is really a collection of stories. You might say case studies, except for they're really not separate at all, because they're so interconnected through this relational and really even in many ways theological connectedness. At the heart of this entire movement, and it really was a movement that was happening in the late 60s and 70s, was this network of people that, you know, you go to L'Abri and then you go to Regent, and then maybe you'd start a study center, or you knew someone at this study center, and this interpersonal relational network was hugely important to the start of this. And the other thing about it is, to an organization, these are startups. So if you're interested in starting new things or in leading a startup, this book shows how evangelicals who are trying very hard to engage culture and use their minds and love their neighbor all at the same time, how they started organization or after organization, sometimes in their homes, sometimes on the edge of campus. So it's really a book about startups. And the startup that started it all, I think, is Francis and Edith Schaeffer's L'Abri. L'Abri is French for shelter. And I hate to use the word intentional community because we think of this commune thing. And they were very explicit from the beginning, as are people in L'Abri, to say, we're not a commune. We are a community of people seeking the Lord and seeking to grow our minds and to love each other, right? To seek truth. So L'Abri starts in 1955, but there's a backstory, right? Francis and Edith Schaeffer were fundamentalist pastoral couple. Francis, pastor, and I always like to give a shout out to Grove City, Pennsylvania, his first pastorate. And he starts in a small town in Western Pennsylvania, goes to Eastern Pennsylvania, then eventually on to a big kind of downtown church in St. Louis, where his profile rises. And he's moving up in his denomination, and it's a separatist fundamentalism. That means that they don't work with people who don't share basically their exact same theological views. And those are rooted in the 1912, 1915 era books, The Fundamentals, that hence the name fundamentalist. And so he is a separatist fundamentalist. So he forms, for instance, his own children's ministry in order to kind of counteract the effect of Child Evangelism Fellowship, which wasn't separatist enough. And so he comes to some prominence through that, and he eventually gets asked to be a missionary to Europe in 1948 with the Independent Board of Presbyterian Foreign Missions, the leading fundamentalist mission agency. This is post-World War II, Europe's rebuilding, and Francis goes, and then eventually his family comes to work with children. But he undergoes a crisis of faith when he's over there. So in the winter and spring of 1951, he basically, his faith disappears. He's overcome by doubt. He spends the winter and spring pacing the second floor of the barn. Edith's writing to her praying family saying, I don't know what's going to happen. You can tell she's a little nervous. But he comes out of it realizing that his faith needs to have more room for love of other Christians, what he would eventually call the mark of a Christian. It's not that he doesn't care about truth, that he doesn't care about theology, but he realizes that Christians have been at each other's throats. And so he has this kind of wider concept of the church. And he also has this sense of in some ways it's a freedom, because he goes back to his basic beliefs and kind of builds his faith from the ground up. And so out of that, L'Abri wouldn't have happened without that, because he has this appreciation of the need for people to get honest answers for honest questions. And so when L'Abri starts in 1955, that's what he and Edith are after, inviting people to their home for honest answers to honest questions. And so what ends up happening is the Independent Board of Presbyterian Foreign Missions doesn't like their home-based hospitality and evangelism very much. And so what they end up doing is telling them, we're not really going to keep you anymore. And so they're going through all this crisis. Out of it all, and I have to summarize it quickly, out of it all, L'Abri, they find a house, they start hosting students on their own as independent missionaries dependent on God for provision. And L'Abri became this kind of word of mouth thing. They didn't advertise, they didn't seek students. It's hard to even imagine, but guests started to come. That's what they called them, guests, and they could come for free. And then there were a few workers who got paid. And then after 1960, when they started Farrell House, they had a study center, so they had students that could come. And then many students, after their 3 months were up, they wanted to stay on, so they became helpers. And then the people that were the real power brokers at L'Abri were the members. And Schaeffer, he gets some publicity through a Times article in Time in 1960 called Mission to the Intellectuals. But really, it's in 1968 when he publishes these books, and I have to hold them up because there's these great IVP books, these slim volumes. So The God Who's There and Escape from Reason, and he becomes this kind of evangelical celebrity almost overnight. He had toured also some evangelical colleges. In 65, he was in the Boston area and then out to the Midwest. And so he's becoming this celebrity. And suddenly, Labrie, Edith's writing to her family, we don't have an off season anymore. And that's 68. And what some people call the zenith of Labrie. And then by 73, Edith's saying, it doesn't even feel like a family anymore. There's so many people here taking my photo, asking questions. I can't even breathe. And Francis and Edith actually move out. And what you start to see in this story is a little bit of how the celebrity pool, not that they were necessarily seeking it, but actually changed the feel on the ground. But in the meantime, they had influenced a generation of evangelicals to want to love God with their whole heart and mind, and to believe that faith was something that applied to all vocations and applied to art. And so you can imagine this young evangelical from Nebraska that scrounges up, or from the Midwest anywhere, that scrounges up money and gets a ticket to Europe and is backpacking around. And they end up at a dinner table at Labrie, and they're sitting there next to maybe this Harvard graduate or a Harvard PhD or something, and chances are they had never, ever known anyone that had gone to an Ivy League school. And here they are rubbing shoulders and learning together and becoming friends. Those relationships become really important as evangelicals move into more prominent places in society in the 70s. Newsweek called 1976 the year of the evangelical. And as evangelicals move into society more, and as they get more and more education, those relationships become hugely important. So there was this spiritual dimension to Labrie, an intellectual one, and one based around hospitality. And I think there was an aspirational one. Labrie taught a generation of evangelicals how to aspire to greater cultural awareness, greater cultural activity, and even potentially kind of taught them how to be in the halls of power with some sort of social and cultural sense. Now, the thing about Schaeffer is he was primarily influenced by very few scholars, and his network was very small, mostly people that he had trained. With the exception of Hans Ruckmacher, there weren't a lot of scholars that he was close with. So he's kind of isolated. Now, the other example that I use in the early part of the book is the sense of, this two-tiered influence on the study center movement. So Labrie being one, then you have across almost on the other side of the earth in Vancouver, this upstart community of Plymouth Brethren, young scholars and business people that had this idea in the 60s to start a school for training Plymouth Brethren and other folks in ministry. And so Marshall Shepard, he's a shoe salesman in Vancouver. He starts a quarterly called Calling, and he's kind of linking the Plymouth Brethren community in Vancouver. And he starts in the 60s talking about this school. And he gets young Plymouth Brethren scholars like Ward Gask, who had just graduated from Fuller and was working on a Ph.D. with F.F. Bruce, another prominent Plymouth Brethren scholar, and Don Tinder, and eventually Carl Armerding pretty shortly thereafter. And he starts building this committee. And so what we get is a school that's connected to encouraging lay people to think really well about their faith and then go out into all kinds of vocations. And at the helm was James Houston, this Oxonian professor at Oxford of geography, who just had a passion for relationship and for network building. And so Regent becomes, and he also had a passion for linking Regent with the university. And so Regent becomes an example of a study center that was aimed toward lay people like Labrie, but anchored to affiliation with the University of British Columbia and university influence. And so those two streams really go on to influence most of the study centers, and most of them are influenced by both streams. So you can see the difference in, for instance, R.C. Sproul's Ligonier Valley Study Center, only influenced by Labrie, not Regent. And it looks a little different than, say, the Center for Christian Study at UVA, which is founded by Houston's research assistant, Bayot Steiner, in 1975. And with Bayot had some connection with Labrie, as had many others in the Charlottesville community, and also had been very involved at Regent. He had actually written the white paper on the replication of Regent, and that's what he's trying to do on some level, replicate Regent. Not as much as the Christian Center C.S. Lewis Institute in DC, which was explicitly trying to replicate Regent, as was New College Berkeley, But at the Christian Study Center, we have Labrie and Regent coming together to influence students, and eventually it's undergrads. And that's where they make a turn to financial stability and toward kind of longevity, because the late 70s and 80s were tough on study centers, and many almost collapsed or completely changed. But what happens in the 90s at the Center for Christian Study, after it almost collapses in the mid 80s, and Drew Trotter comes on and kind of rebuilds it, and he builds a bigger building, and they set up a journal called Praxis, and the word gets out that this study center is still focusing on graduate students, but it's also really starting to focus on undergrads, and that's a constantly renewing pool of folks. And so the Center for Christian Study becomes a model, and out of that, then we get the Consortium of Christian Study Centers and the movement that's happening today. And I think it's a pretty encouraging movement for the evangelical mind and the Christian mind in general. It's really encouraging students to dig into their faith, but also their minds. And the idea that James Davison Hunter put forward in his book, To Change the World, of faithful presence, is really at the heart of the consortium. And this idea that they want to be neighbors to the university, maybe, and friends that have differences, sure, truth matters. But at the same time, they want to be not adversarial. And so it's interesting as we move forward what will happen with study centers, because really there's this interesting model of a study center being very much independent on the edge of a university. So if there are anti-bias laws or questions about religious freedom, study centers can kind of transcend that by being just across the street, and they can still influence the university. So there's this kind of way in which it's a backdoor to university influence, but there's also this way in which they want to come alongside and encourage the whole project, and really encouraging flourishing, holistic mind, body, spirit on university campuses. There's about 30 in the consortium now, and over half have been formed in the last 10 years. So it's a movement that's really growing. I could say so much more, but I have to stop. Thanks for checking that out.
Thank you, Charlie. I had the privilege of reading Charlie's book and reviewing it, and just want to emphasize to everyone out there, one of the great parts of the structure of the book is that each chapter is dedicated to one of these institutions. And so you really get a story within the bigger story in each chapter that takes you from the sort of founding struggle of the institution up through they all end at different places. So there's all different types of conclusions. But in the process, that bigger story of creating this really thick relational and intellectual network really comes through. By the end of the book, you really get a sense of this broader movement, the Christian Study Center movement that's now 50-something years old. So thanks again, Charlie. I want to now bring in Jon Boyd, Executive Academic Director, Editor at InterVarsity Press. Jon is a trained historian himself with a Ph.D. in intellectual history from the Johns Hopkins University. And he's also been a champion of Charlie's project since it was first acquired by IVP some years ago. So now Jon and Charlie are going to have a discussion here for a few minutes. Jon, thanks for joining us, and take it away.
My pleasure. I'm friends with some of the folks at Upper House in Madison, and have been for a long time. So it's a treat to have been collaborating on this. And Charlie is one of these people I've never actually met in person. In fact, we've had more video face-to-face here during the pandemic than we did all along. So one of these days we're actually going to be able to shake hands, and I'm going to get your autograph and my copy of your book and all that. I'm looking forward to it. Charlie, I know you are a real historian. That means you, in my view, your superpower comes from when you get your hands on archival sources, then the energy flows. And I think we've got a taste of your energy here this afternoon in your talking about this. So I know you'll appreciate it. In preparation for this, I thought, I got to go back and dig out that first email. Where can I go back to the beginning? And in fact, in my email archives, I've got an email from September 29th, 2017. So I was surprised it's actually almost 3 years ago. But it's actually not an email to you. It's an email to Scott Sundquist, because he had mentioned your name when we were in a face-to-face meeting in June of that summer. And I had it sitting on my desk, and it was just like a scribbled note. I didn't even know what it meant. But it said like Cotherman, UVA. And so anyway, this email in September of 2017 is to Scott saying, "Can you explain this note that I left to myself?" and he said, "Oh yeah, he filled me in on your project and said you definitely need to reach out." So I did email you. I was glad we caught the opportunity quickly to start talking about a book, and I've been really delighted to be in that conversation with you all along. So it's fun here to realize that at the end of the arc, every book's got a long arc. Even though this one feels like it's gone pretty quickly to me, I'm impressed that it's 3 years. So it's fun to talk with you here.
Yeah.
I thought, I knew that you were going to give a little bit of the overview of the book and kind of a thumbnail sketch of some of the sources and argument of the material. But then I thought it might be fun for people to hear us chat a little bit about some of the behind the scenes
Sure.
stuff, and also just a little bit more about you personally, and kind of some of your process that goes into it. So really I've got some questions here, kind of free form, but mostly kind of letting people get to hear a little bit more about the authoring process and you yourself.
Sure.
In fact, the first one, I think I want to come back to even the way Dan was introducing you. You are a pastor as well as an author, an academic and a community person. You've published even these 2 books just with us in the last year, one a work of historical scholarship and one in the practical nuts and bolts, a handbook really for church planners. So, but anyway, that makes me wonder, I'm genuinely curious. We've never talked about this, but what are some of the differences that you see between pastoring and authorship? Whether that's kind of the daily life or the goals that you have in mind. Either similarities or differences. Really, I'm interested in kind of that too. You've got those 2 things going, and that's kind of interesting to me.
Yeah. Well, dedication and discipline are definitely part of both, because you're on your own on so many. I mean, I was a church planter with like 8 people in our living room. So there was no one over like telling me what to do, and it's like you are a PhD student, you're writing every day, you're going to have to check in like a couple times a year, and so there's that kind of just like before God, you lay it before God. I want to be faithful, and you kind of work as best you can, as hard as you can on your own. But I love that. And I think one of the main differences for me is I'm this kind of weird personality where, people talk about, you get charged up by being with people, or you get charged up by being alone, and like both charge me up. So as a pastor, I could be with people almost all the time and just having coffee and having conversation. At the same time, I could spend days in this attic and I'd be all right. So it's this kind of weird disconnect that I'm always trying to balance, to be faithful to both projects. Yeah.
That's cool. Let me kind of ask also, you mentioned this in your remarks too. Say a little bit more about the local churches that have study centers. Again, I'm just following up on your being a pastor. What are those like, and do you recommend that? Do you think churches should? And what are some do's and don'ts? What does the life of a church-based study center look like?
Yeah, so it ranges. One of the things I was always amazed at, I would always find these study center brochures in the archives, like for ones I had never heard of, in like churches in Pittsburgh or they were just all over. And so really they could be large, they could be small. Usually it meant that they had a library, and usually a tape library, or a library with like Stott's books and Schaefer, things like that. But then there were some really big ones. I mean, Stuart Briscoe's church, that's where Drew Trotter got his study center start in Milwaukee. That was a large one, and many of the larger ones would tie in. Eventually, they started tying into seminary credit, with Trinity, Evangelical Divinity School, or something like that, Reformed Seminary, much like study centers at universities do. So there's a wide range, and because no one owned the name study center, I mean, you wouldn't have to have much to call yourself a study center. You just have to like books and coffee, and you're there. But I think there's a lot of room for that, and even you start thinking about the Falls Church Fellows and stuff, and how is that a study center and things like that, because there's a lot of that kind of same impetus there. So I think there's a lot of good. The one thing I like about the University Study Center model is it keeps these folks who might be tempted, like many evangelicals in the past, and like I sometimes feel myself, to build your nice little walls and your nice little shelters. It keeps them their feet to the fire because they're at the university and they're at that kind of like cultural melting pot. And so there's something really good about interacting on a regular basis, and you can't get away from it with the university.
Right. Yeah. That's interesting. I mean, you're talking about anything can be a study center. I would say your attic looks like a study center to me with all those books. I don't know. You don't really have the lecture space to bring in a big speaker there, though.
Right.
Let me ask you a question about another kind of material that went into your book.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I don't know if this is going to come across on the camera, but for those who haven't seen the book, it's loaded with photos of the prime actors and plenty of historical photos and even some documents, promotional things from various study centers and demonstrations of the kind of things that folks were publishing. I think this is another dimension of your book that I really resonated with as an historian. You were doing the oral interviews, to capture the oral history with people who were still alive and wanted to talk about, their insider knowledge of the history. Yes, you were in the archives looking at documents and secondary materials and all that. But I know you really sunk your teeth into these visual resources. I'm wondering, tell me a little bit about how those clicked for you. How did you know when you were seeing something that you really wanted to both interpret and then include in the book to help the reader visualize things? Does that feel like a natural to you, or what's your mindset on the visual stuff?
It felt pretty natural to me, although it was harder than I thought. Having edited a book before this with no photos and then finding one with photos, that's a lot more legwork. But it's really rewarding. I love the fact that you can pick up this book and just run through the pages and see like what it looked like, because that gives you a sense of this history in a way that just the words wouldn't, because these were such embodied places. You almost need the photos. And so things like the beauty of L'Abri. I mean, those photos of like the four young women on the mountainside having a picnic or something with the mountains in the background. I mean, or of Linda Mercandante just working in the garden. I think those are amazing. And so many, I mean, you gotta love the photos out of Berkeley in the late 60s and early 70s. They're so good. And it was hard to choose which ones actually, because there were so many photos. Or the Ligonier Valley Study Center, and those were taken from table talk, and honestly, talking about history that you can touch, digging through. It started digging through my father-in-law's fruit cellar for like old musty copies he had saved from old Jubilee conferences, and literally I'm in these like mid-70s, late 70s table talks with purple mold on them, looking through them like I gotta find these photos, and then there was those few that were really tricky to track down. Like that one of Edith is especially close to my heart because it really shows who she was. But that Sylvester Jacob, I had to work with him, because that one was one that was originally to be published in the 1973 book Portrait of a Shelter, right? So I love the photos. I think they're a history within a history.
Yeah, it's just a video camera. This is the photo of Edith you're talking about, right?
Mm-hmm.
I love that one, and it's true. Charlie's he is not exaggerating when he says there's a lot of extra work that went into that for him, especially tracking down permissions. And anyway, good job. You did a fabulous job with that, because imagery is in some ways really easy to include in a book, but there's all that behind the scenes work. So thanks for doing that. I think it enriches it too. Yeah, I was reflecting as you were giving your summary of the book. It's really one of the themes that really animates the book. I think that this is a movement of the life of the mind, and that's a really familiar phrase to many of us as an InterVarsity undergraduate and grad student. Life of the mind was a really motivating thing to me. But you do a really great job, and I think the visuals, the photos help showing how this is a life of the body thing too. This is, it's that hospitality embodied. It's a place you can go. They're going to give you a bed and a meal, and take care of your embodied needs and your embodied connections to other people, as well as the life of the mind. So I think that the visuals really help with that. Well, let me ask you another question. This is something that I find historians have a particular opportunity to stretch themselves and therefore get some insight in. And it's really a question about how you relate to the historical subjects that you're studying. And I hope that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Like I could ask you as a pastor, how do you relate to your neighbors? You know, how do you deal with the difficult, you know, church board member? You know, what do you do after a sermon when somebody complains? I'm really asking that same kind of question, but when these are folks in the past, some of whom may be dead, how do you conceive of and maintain your healthy relationship, if you will, with people you may like and maybe some people you may not like? I'm wondering if you can dish a little bit about the subject here.
Yeah, sure. One of the things, and I've talked to some other historians who have written on things that they maybe topics about people that they did not like very much at all. Like I was kind of blessed to write about most of these people, like I thought were pretty cool. But at the same time, you know, I think just basic Christian characteristics, humility, you know, like loving one's neighbor, like trying to give the best possible read you could when it was available. So like one of the things my advisor always talked to me about was critical empathy. You know, you want to be able to be critical, but you want to also empathize, you know, and not judge them necessarily by the standards of this time or, you know, too harshly, you know. And that's one of the things I thought this book, I hope it did, I thought it did, was especially people that have been controversial, like Francis Schaeffer. You know, one of the things that drove this project early on was my thought that like there has to be more to Schaeffer than what I read about in all the historiography that I've been reading about the religious right, because he influenced so many people and so many people talk about him that it can't just be about abortion and things like that. And so it was like, you know, I think most of these organizations had some things that were like tough, or maybe they went some ways that maybe in the long run weren't the best, but at the same time, there's a lot to be commended. And so someone like Schaeffer, you can't just put him into a box. He's such a nuanced human being. And so many of these people were.
Right. Yeah,
but I will
cool.
say sometimes, you know, my colleagues who are historians that just study dead people, the live people can come back and say,
Yeah.
I think you got this wrong, you know. And it was funny that it was the dissertation, I didn't get much feedback that way, but as soon as I got the contract, I suddenly started hearing from people who thought I got it a little bit wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, that bound dissertation's not going to do any harm. It's just going to be on the shelves in Charlottesville, right? What's the problem? Oh, wait. No, there are going to be thousands of copies loose in the world. Great. Well, as I say, it's been a treat for me to work with you on this and the other book as well. And I'm really glad, you know, any book launch is an opportunity for celebration, and I hope you feel the milestone here of the launch month and are hearing lots of good things, and also keep your sights tuned toward what your next project might be. I'm sure, you know, I'm all ears for whatever else might be next. But that's farther down the road. Today is really about celebrating and helping kick off the life of the book now, you know, that really matters, the life of the book in the hand of the reader. So anyway, thanks a lot. Yeah,
thanks, John, for all your help along the way.
Thanks, John. We're going to move now to our final part of the hour and do some Q&A. We already have a number of really good questions in the Q&A box. Please ask more if you have something on your mind. Charlie, I'm going to just throw these to you, and I'm really thinking about questions that can sort of highlight different parts of the book. And really, you know, make people interested to read more. So this is a question from an anonymous person, but per your research, what have you observed to be the key, let's say 2 to 3 factors leading to the successful launch of a study center? What's sort of the thing that you would say are the secret ingredients to getting it right?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, and it's one I think about sometimes myself, because sometimes in the back, you know, when you're really dreaming, you start thinking, maybe a study center, you know? So if you're that person, I understand. So I think the one thing I would start with is a really good team. I think having not necessarily staff, you can't, obviously, a startup, you won't have that kind of money, but a team of supporters, and honestly, a local church has helped many a study center just get off the ground. Trinity Presbyterian Church in Charlottesville is a great example of that. It actually came after the study center, but was hugely important to the study center through its life. So you got to have the right people, and people with, I think, a certain disposition, people that aren't out to like prove it to the university, but that are kind of like I keep coming back to that humble confidence, you don't know it all, but you know something, and you're okay with that. And you can learn from other people that know something you don't know. I think that kind of ironic tone to the university and also to campus ministry. It's very important that study centers, and the Center for Christian Study has been a model for this, really have a unifying impact on campus ministry. The last thing a study center should ever do is put a wedge between campus ministries. So in Charlottesville, they've been a site for monthly campus-wide ministry meetings for decades, and it's been very important for them. And so they house even many campus ministers in their building. And I love that model. I think it's pretty important.
Awesome, thanks. There had been another anonymous question about the differences between study centers and campus-based Christian ministries. And then the follow-up was, how do study centers avoid being perceived as competitive with those ministries? So it sounds like you were sort of going there. Is there anything else you want to say on sort of that topic of those comparisons?
I do think it's important to note that a study center is not a campus ministry with a house. It's different, even a campus ministry that values the life of a mind with a house is not a study center necessarily. Like a study center has study at the core of what it is. I mean, it's not more valuable than spirituality, but it's definitely like right there linked with it, like it's just like the Center for Christian Study is the name of the one in Charlottesville, so it has a different role than a campus ministry, though it is a campus ministry. But I think because of that, it can encourage campus ministries. It can come alongside without being seen as a competitor, in certain ways. And the other thing study centers that succeed in that do is they make their resources available to the campus ministries to use for their own programming and their own, like Charlottesville for years has let campus ministers use their photocopier machine. And when they weren't as prevalent as they are now, that was important.
Definitely. Okay, this question is from Tim Wang. He is an IV staff, InterVarsity staff at UT Austin. And he had never heard of the Christian faith and life community in the 1950s, which I think you mentioned briefly in your book. Yeah. So he said, I was intrigued by it. I'm curious if you can speak more about it. So do you just have any, a sort of short summary of what that was and its importance to the story? Yeah.
And I'll tell you where to find out more about it. Doug Rossino, I think Doug's his first name, has a book called The Politics of Authenticity, and he has a whole chapter or two on it, and it's all about UT Austin. And it's really great. And so that's where basically every part of that intro little clip I gave comes from. So I'd highly recommend that book. But long story short, it was this, a Presbyterian pastor, mainline Presbyterian, is kind of influenced by the kind of movements across, just within Christianity, especially around Bonhoeffer and things like that, to create these communities. He creates one. And eventually, within a couple years, he starts to kind of leave Orthodox Christianity. And then his replacement goes even further. And so it's really is kind of like, I use it as a counterpoint to Francis Schaeffer, because they both have their kind of crises of faith. And that study center goes the opposite direction, kind of leaving faith behind in pursuit of political action. But I will say that's not only a left-leaning study centers. It could happen the opposite way to a study center maybe leans the other way.
Sure. This question is from Chris Armstrong. Charlie, what do you think the next 10, 20, 50 years of Christian study centers holds? Are there any signs of growth or influence? What challenges or opportunities are on the horizon? So you don't take one part of that maybe, but where do you see the movement going in general?
Yeah, okay, so in some senses it's tough for a historian, but I'll put on my pastor hat for a second in some ways. But I think there are two things that would come to my mind readily. One would be, I don't see it going anywhere soon. I think it's going to expand. I think there's a reason that it's doubled in the last 10 years. I think there's a reason you're getting more institutionalization around in the consortium and some more networking that has going to have more and more resources to plant more, I think that's going to happen. I think there may even be like a mini study center planting movement happen. So that's like, I think of that as a positive thing. But I think the other thing to be aware of is whenever the movements grow, when they're small, like L'Abre's first 10 years, no one really cared what they did. No one knew about them. But suddenly when you become bigger and people care, more people have a stake in it, more people want to use it to their ends. And so I think it's going to be really important for the study center movement to really define who and what it is in the next 10 years really well, and to kind of remember some of the stuff that's in this history to be able to say, this is what has defined us, and these are the pitfalls that we've seen, because growth brings greater challenges.
Yeah, which you show very well, particularly with L'Abre's growth, or Francis Schaeffer's personal celebrity. Yeah, very well. This was actually the first question in. It was by an anonymous person. I'm going to rephrase it a little, but can you talk a little about the role that study centers played in opening up theological education to women, particularly in the 60s and 70s? I know that's part of the Regent College chapter in particular, but can you just give a little sense of how you see the study centers playing a role in that move to more egalitarian thinking within evangelicalism?
Sure. I think it's thanks for bringing that up. I think it's a really a main underlying theme in the book is that study centers were good for women. It wasn't perfect. It was I call it an evangelical openness, because you still had some of these very prominent study center leaders like Schaeffer or like R.C. Sproul that definitely did not think women should be ordained. Even at Regent, you had people like Packer and Walke that did not think women should be ordained and would carry that for a long time to the end of their life or ministry. But at the same time, because both were lay, like L'Abri wasn't trying to train pastors, neither was Regent. Really, R.C. Sproul wasn't. So many of these were for lay people. And if you have lay people, like most churches, if you open them to lay people, you're going to have more women than men. Same kind of things happening. And women were given equal access to training in most of these places, So what happened was that it seemed that it was just like the spark that lit a fuse, and they kept digging in, and Linda Mercandante's story, or Thina Ayer's story, even going through places seminaries that weren't really open to women and surviving and kind of coming out on the end. And then there were places like New College, Berkeley, and the Christian World Liberation Front, which were intentionally trying to be egalitarian in a way that no one else was. And so some of the kind of evangelical feminism of the 70s really has some of its leaders come from that community.
Yeah, that's fascinating. There's a number of questions here that I'll try to group together. Can you just give a sense, you do it really well in the book, what are the actual intellectual pursuits that are happening at the study centers? Sort of, what are they trying to address when they're meeting with students? One of these questions comes from David Sparks, who's a Ph.D. student pursuing a career as a scientist and wondering about Christian study centers. Can you just give a sense of sort of what's actually going on in the four walls of the study center?
Yeah, and this is one of those things too, where some of the folks on this call, they've been living this for 2 decades, or more. But I'll say this, it is pretty wide ranging. So everything from like events of hospitality. So I'll speak to the one I know the best, the Center for Christian Study at UVA, and even Theological Horizons at UVA, similar things like lots of meals. So the Center for Christian Study has exam snacks 3 times a day during exam week. Every day of exam week, you can come for a full meal at the study center, and hundreds of students show up, some of them not Christian for sure. It's an outreach, or movement day lunch. Orientation. So there's a sense of like Christian socialization happening. Like when you orient all the students on that orientation day, you suddenly know many Christian professors and many students, and you realize you're not alone. So there's that social dynamic and hospitality dynamic, but there's also this intellectual dynamic. So there's courses taught, and many of these study centers are hiring people with PhDs or advanced degrees. They're very good at what they do, and they're teaching courses for like 6 undergrads. And that's what an opportunity to sit in on, a course by a theology PhD student talking about, Augustine or something like that. I think it's amazing. Another one I sat in on was one about faith and science, which was really great. And the head of the Atheists and Agnostics Association of UVA sat in on that class for the entirety of it, which I thought was a really interesting thing, right? You have this dialogue happening between the head of the Atheists and Agnostics Association and the Christian Study Center class. Some of them have seminary courses available, which I think is a really interesting way to really has been for a long time and continues to be a very interesting thing to do and worthwhile. Yeah, so it just ranges. If you start looking at their course offerings, you have everything from managing your time to like the Old Testament to like out at Berkeley, it was like how to like live simply, you know, it was just amazing.
Yeah, that's great. I assume because of that startup culture that's around a lot of the study centers, there's just a lot of experimenting going on all the time about new ways to connect with students, new ways to host events, all that kind of stuff. I think it's really sort of a laboratory for thinking of new ways of doing it on campus. Laura Lynch asks a question about, in your conclusion, you mentioned cultivating faithful presence may entail asking hard questions about which of the faithful are actually present, not only in the study center programming, but also in the movement's leadership structures. Yeah. Can you talk a little more about what you were trying to get at there?
Yeah, so, well, I mean, it is a movement that's led by a lot of white men. It's true, and has been historically. If you look at you know, the cover of the book, it tells a story. I think it's something to be very aware of. Racial, gender, diversity needs, and honestly, the consortium and other study centers, to their credit, are trying, but it's still something to be tackled head on. I think the other one that people don't notice, but as someone living in small town rural America right now and who's been from there notices, is like the socioeconomic and geographical kind of lack of diversity in some of these places, and even where people think it's worth trying to start a study center. You know, there's a lot of kind of elite status at some of these places, and I think it would be a shame if the study center movement only went to elite so-called strategic places, because the gospel, in my opinion, goes everywhere. And so I'd like to see the study center planting movement, whatever it becomes, that, you know, a little more emphasis put on maybe like second-tier state schools and like places that are a little more out of the way.
Thank you. This question comes from Carl Armerding, who makes an appearance in your book. He says, this is an interesting sort of counterfactual. With all the models that Regent might have taken, did it ever occur to you that Regent might have accomplished its goals better had it been a true study center? And then he mentions that he and Ward ended up both running study centers later. So, you know, what are the trade-offs for what Regent did to sort of associate and become really part of the University of British Columbia?
Yeah, well, it's such a unique case, and it's one that, as the C.S. Lewis Institute proved in this country, is almost impossible to do in the United States, and was maybe just something of like a, you know, a kind of Canadian province that was on the edge of the frontier on some level, you know, was available to them. So it's hard to say what would have been different. I find the example of Regent pretty compelling, even though there are different takes on it. I think Regent did some things that no one else could do, and it's part of its team, and it's part of its location, and its network with the Plymouth Brother and open communities, you know. So I don't know if Regent could have done better if it were a study center. I'm pretty impressed with Regent, actually.
Yeah, I'd say as someone who works at a study center, a lot of us talk about Regent as like this model we'd love to actually try to move toward in some ways, you know, in our American context being different. So I think there's probably grass is always greener on the other side, maybe with both sides of the question. We're wrapping up here. We just have a few more minutes. One question that I've seen a couple times that might be at the forefront of some people's minds is, what's the relationship between Christian study centers and Christian colleges, which is obviously a place that trains a lot of young Christians to think Christianly as well. Is there any historical relationship? Do you see them as serving separate roles? What's the relationship there?
Well, so I do like what Drew Trotter says, that Christian colleges are study centers just on a larger scale. Like, they're trying to teach people how to think Christianly. So it would be kind of like redundant to have a study center at a Christian college if the college is doing its job. But that being said, there's a lot of overlap, and the study center movement benefits immensely from Christian liberal arts education growing in the post-World War II era where these Christian students suddenly care. I mean, where do people start going to L'Abri from? I mean, they hear Schaeffer, of course, at MIT and at Harvard and Boston, but they also hear him at Wheaton and Westmont, you know, and Calvin. And so these schools are really important for funneling people into the movement because they're already teaching Christians to think. And also, if you look at a place like Regent, I mean, its early faculty had the benefit of Christian liberal arts education, and that was really important. It's young scholars, at least.
Great, thank you. One last question. This will be from Philip, and it's just looking. I'm going to ask you to put your pastor hat on again instead of your historian hat. Where do you see study centers moving in this new post-COVID era? Like, is there anything you're looking out for? Anything you're anticipating, particularly in this next year when we're all sort of, particularly higher ed is so changing so rapidly?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think is always worth paying attention to is funding. How are the study centers doing financially, you know, and especially newer ones, right, without as much of an alumni base and donor base. I think that's something to be aware of. You know, I hope, I mean, in our church, we had to go digital. We're still digital, and we're trying to figure out how to reopen, and that's not easy at all. And I think it may be similar things, obviously, for universities, but also for study centers. Like, what does reopening look like? When food and sharing meals and stuff was so important. My biggest hope is that this is a blip on the radar and that study centers can get back to doing that, you know, as soon as possible. Because if you can't tell by reading the book, I'm not really impressed a huge deal by going to a completely digital ministry. It just was, you know, when Ligonier did that, I think they lost something that was really important.
Yeah. That's I encourage readers to read that chapter about Ligonier, which basically goes digital in the 80s, if I'm remembering the timing right, and moves to a video cassette ministry. And there's an undertone there, Charlie, of your sort of your furrowed brow as the move is happening. So you can definitely, and that just hits new in 2020 for sure, in a way it might not have last year even. So with that, Charlie, I want to thank you one more time. Thank you for the book. Thank you for your ministry. Thank you for the time you spent with us here today.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks for paying attention, everyone, and God bless.
All right, thank you, Charlie. Go in peace, everybody, and have a good day.